It was just another Tuesday afternoon at Riverside Mall, the kind where sunlight streamed through the giant glass ceiling, creating warm patches on the polished floor. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, with her silver streaked hair neatly pinned back and wearing her favorite blue cardigan, sat down on one of the wooden benches near the central fountain. Her feet were tired after 2 hours of shopping for her grandchildren's birthday presents. She watched the water dance in the fountain, remembering how she used to bring her own children here years ago. They'd always beg to throw pennies in, making wishes that made her smile. Now, at 68, she still found peace in those sparkling waters, even as the mall had changed around her over the decades. As she organized her shopping bags, arranging them neatly beside her bench, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten slightly. A police officer, standing near the pretzel stand, kept looking in her direction while speaking into his radio. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Surely he was just doing his job, keeping an eye on the afternoon crowd. But there was something in his stance, in the way his eyes narrowed when they met hers, that made her feel uneasy. Mrs. Thompson had spent 32 years as a school teacher at Lincoln Elementary, teaching generations of children about respect, kindness, and fairness. She always taught her students to trust police officers, to see them as helpers and protectors of the community. Even now, she tried to hold onto that belief as Officer Barrett's suspicious glances continued. She reached for her phone, thinking maybe she should call her son, just to hear his reassuring voice. But then she stopped herself. "Don't be silly, Eleanor," she whispered to herself, smoothing her cardigan. "You have every right to be here." She pulled out her shopping receipts instead, carefully checking that she had everything for the upcoming family celebration. The mall buzzed with typical afternoon activity. Teenagers laughing by the food court, mothers pushing strollers, elderly couples walking arm in arm. Mrs. Thompson smiled at a young girl who waved at her while skipping past. The child reminded her of her students, always so full of joy and innocence. But that warm moment was interrupted when she saw Officer Barrett speaking into his radio again, this time more urgently. He was walking towards her now, his hand resting on his belt in a way that made her heart beat faster. The afternoon light that had seemed so pleasant just moments ago suddenly felt harsh and exposing. Mrs. Thompson sat up straighter, squaring her shoulders the way she used to when addressing a particularly challenging class. She'd lived in this community for over 4 decades, volunteered at the hospital every weekend, and helped establish the local library's reading program. She had nothing to be afraid of, she told herself. Yet she couldn't ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her chest as Officer Barrett's footsteps grew closer. Around her, a few shoppers had begun to notice the scene unfolding. An elderly couple slowed their pace, watching with concerned expressions. A young man with shopping bags paused by the fountain, his phone partially raised. The peaceful afternoon atmosphere had shifted, becoming charged with tension that seemed to crackle in the air like static before a storm. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, reminding herself of something she always told her students. Dignity isn't just about how others treat you. It's about how you carry yourself. She gathered her belongings closer, preparing herself for whatever was about to happen, praying that her son's words about staying calm in difficult situations would stay with her now when she needed them most. The sound of Officer Barrett's boots on the mall's tile floor grew louder with each step. The peaceful shopping trip was about to take a turn that would not only change Mrs. Thompson's life, but would spark a conversation that her entire community needed to have. Officer Barrett stopped directly in front of Mrs. Thompson, his shadow falling across her shopping bags. His face was set in hard lines, and his voice carried that edge of authority that she'd heard too many times before in situations like this. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "There have been several shoplifting incidents reported in the last hour." Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I assure you, I have receipts for everything I've purchased today." She reached for her shopping bags, ready to prove her innocence, even though something deep inside her whispered that she shouldn't have to. The officer's hand moved to his belt. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, causing several passers-by to stop in their tracks. The afternoon mall crowd had grown quieter, with only the fountain's gentle splashing breaking the tense silence. "Officer, please," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her teacher's voice still carrying that natural authority she developed over 3 decades in the classroom. "I'm just a grandmother shopping for my grandchildren's birthdays. I've lived in this community longer than you've been alive." But Officer Barrett seemed unmoved. "Stand up slowly," he commanded, his hand still hovering near his belt. Mrs. Thompson could feel her heart pounding, but she thought of her son, of his lessons about staying dignified under pressure. By now, a small crowd had gathered. A young woman with a baby stroller looked on with concern, while a teenage boy had his phone out, recording everything. An elderly man stepped forward as if to intervene, but his wife gently pulled him back, their faces etched with worry. "I've been shopping at this mall since it opened in 1982, Mrs. Thompson explained, her voice clear despite her rising anxiety. "I taught at Lincoln Elementary for 32 years. You can call the principal there, or Pastor Wilson at First Community Church. They'll vouch for me." The officer's response was to step closer, his stance becoming more aggressive. "Ma'am, I don't care where you taught or who you know. We have reports matching your description, and you need to comply with my instructions immediately." Mrs. Thompson could feel tears threatening to form, but she blinked them back. She thought of all the times she told her students to stand up for themselves while remaining respectful, to be brave while staying calm. Now she needed to live those lessons. More phones had come out, recording the scene. The mall security guard hovered uncertainly nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unsure how to intervene. The afternoon light through the skylights cast strange shadows across the scene, making everything feel slightly surreal. "Officer." Mrs. Thompson tried one more time, keeping her voice steady. "I have receipts for every single item. I'd be happy to show them to you. There's no need for this kind of approach." She moved carefully, reaching for her purse where she kept her receipts neatly organized, a habit she'd never broken since her teaching days. But that simple movement seemed to trigger something in Officer Barrett. His hand gripped his belt tighter, his voice rising. "I said keep your hands where I can see them. Do not reach for anything." The crowd had grown larger now. A store manager stepped out of her shop, phone in hand, apparently making a call. 2 young mothers huddled together, whispering and shaking their heads. Even the pretzel stand vendor had stopped his work to watch the scene unfold. What should have been a peaceful afternoon of shopping had transformed into something else entirely. A moment that would soon test not just Mrs. Thompson's dignity and strength, but the very fabric of their community. The air in the mall felt heavy with tension, like the moments before a summer storm, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, like a nightmare that no one could stop. Mrs. Thompson, who had spent her entire life following rules and teaching children to do the right thing, slowly rose from the bench. Her legs were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the frustration of being treated this way in a place she'd visited for over 40 years. "Officer, please," she said one more time, her voice carrying the same gentle firmness she'd used with thousands of students over the years. "Let me just show you my receipts." Her hand moved toward her shopping bag, her movements deliberately slow and careful. But Officer Barrett had already made up his mind about the situation. In one swift motion, he grabbed Mrs. Thompson's arm, his fingers digging into her cardigan sleeve. The force of his grip caught her off balance, causing her to stumble. Several gasps rose from the growing crowd as she tried to steady herself. "I told you not to move." Officer Barrett's voice echoed through the mall's atrium, bouncing off the glass ceiling and marble floors. His face had turned red, his authority seemingly challenged by this elderly woman's simple request to prove her innocence. Mrs. Thompson tried to regain her balance, her free hand reaching for the bench behind her. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice trembling but still holding onto its dignity. But instead of releasing his grip, Officer Barrett roughly pulled her forward. That's when it happened, the moment that would soon be shared across social media and news channels nationwide. As Mrs. Thompson stumbled, Officer Barrett struck her arm with his baton, sending her falling backward against the wooden bench. The sound of her body hitting the bench seemed to break the spell of shocked silence that had fallen over the crowd. A chorus of voices rose up immediately. "Oh my God! Someone call 911. This is wrong. Keep recording." The young man who had been recording everything rushed forward, still holding his phone steady. "I've got all of this on video," he announced loudly, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. An older woman ran to Mrs. Thompson's side, her shopping bags forgotten on the floor. The mall's security guard finally found his courage and stepped forward. "Officer, this needs to stop right now," he said, placing himself between Barrett and Mrs. Thompson. His hands were trembling, but his stance was firm. Mrs. Thompson sat on the bench, one hand rubbing her arm where the baton had struck, the other pressed against her chest. Despite the pain and humiliation, she held her head high, her eyes bright with unshed tears. All those years teaching children about justice and fairness seemed to be crumbling around her. The crowd had grown larger now, forming a protective circle around Mrs. Thompson. Phones were everywhere, recording every moment. A store manager approached with a glass of water and a first aid kit. Another person was on the phone, their voice urgent as they spoke to emergency services. Officer Barrett seemed to realize suddenly that things had spiraled out of control. His hand still rested on his baton, but his confidence had visibly wavered as he looked around at the sea of shocked and angry faces. What no one in the mall knew yet was that among the many phone calls being made at that moment, one would bring consequences that Officer Barrett never could have anticipated. Mrs. Thompson's son, a highly respected police captain, was already on his way, about to add another layer to this unfolding story of injustice and accountability. The afternoon light streaming through the mall's skylights illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage, highlighting the stark contrast between an elderly woman's dignity and an officer's abuse of power. The air was thick with tension and the buzz of voices, as everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would demand answers and change. The main entrance doors of Riverside Mall swung open with purpose, and through them walked Captain Michael Thompson. He was still in his formal police uniform, having rushed straight from a community outreach event where he'd been speaking about building trust between police and citizens. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. As he strode through the mall, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, people turned to look. There was something about his presence, a mix of authority and controlled emotion, that made everyone take notice. His chest bore the weight of numerous service medals, each one earned through years of dedicated service to the community. He had received 3 different calls about the incident while at his event. The first was from a former student of his mother's, the second from the mall's security office, and the third from a community member who recognized Mrs. Thompson. Each call had made his heart beat faster, but his training kept him composed. The crowd parted as he approached the scene, whispers rippling through the onlookers. "That's her son. He's the police captain. Watch what happens now." Some people had their phones lowered out of respect, while others continued recording, sensing that this moment would be important. Officer Barrett was still standing there, his hand now off his baton, but his posture stiff and defensive. The moment he saw Captain Thompson's uniform and rank insignia, his face went pale. This wasn't just any superior officer. This was the son of the woman he had just struck. Captain Thompson's first move wasn't toward Officer Barrett, but to his mother. He knelt beside her on the bench, his face softening as he gently touched her arm where the baton had struck. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed mall, "are you okay?" Mrs. Thompson looked up at her son, and for the first time since the incident began, she allowed herself to show vulnerability. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just shopping for the grandchildren." The captain stood up slowly, his face a masterclass in professional composure. He turned to Officer Barrett, and the contrast between the two officers was striking. One represented everything right about law enforcement: dignity, respect, professionalism. The other had just shown everything that could go wrong when power was misused. "Officer Barrett," Captain Thompson's voice was calm, but carried an authority that made everyone in the vicinity stand straighter. "I'm going to need your badge number and your supervisor's contact information." He pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and controlled. The gathered crowd watched in silence as Captain Thompson made several calls in quick succession. First to internal affairs, then to the precinct supervisor, and finally to the department's medical team. He spoke in clear, professional terms, never raising his voice or showing the anger that must have been boiling inside him. A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone in her hand. "Sir," she said to the captain, "I have the whole thing on video, from the moment the officer approached your mother." Others stepped forward too, offering their recordings and contact information as witnesses. The mall security manager arrived with surveillance footage already downloaded onto a tablet. "Captain Thompson," he said, "we have multiple camera angles of the entire incident." The captain nodded gratefully, his professionalism never wavering despite the personal nature of the situation. Officer Barrett stood rooted to the spot, watching as his career crumbled around him. He had acted on prejudice and poor judgment, and now he was facing not just any superior officer, but one whose reputation for fairness and integrity was known throughout the department. The afternoon light was starting to fade outside the mall's windows, casting long shadows across the scene. But rather than ending, this incident was just beginning to unfold. Captain Thompson's presence had transformed it from a simple case of police misconduct into something larger, a moment that would spark significant changes in the department and the community. The crowd remained respectfully quiet now, watching as Captain Thompson efficiently took control of the situation. They were witnessing not just justice in action, but a son protecting his mother while upholding his oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. Captain Thompson stood in the center of the scene like the eye of a storm, bringing order to chaos with each calm command. The medical team he called had arrived and was gently examining his mother's arm, while mall security created a respectful perimeter around them. "Mom," he said softly, kneeling beside her again as the medic worked, "I need you to tell me everything that happened, just like you used to have your students explain things from the beginning." His voice carried the warmth of a son, but maintained the professionalism of his position. Mrs. Thompson straightened her cardigan with her free hand, her teacher's instinct for order showing even now. "I was just sitting here, resting my feet," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I had all my receipts organized, just like I always do. Then that officer started watching me." As she told her story, Captain Thompson's face remained composed, but those who looked closely could see the muscle in his jaw tightening. He took notes on his department-issued pad, his handwriting as neat and precise as ever, even under these circumstances. Officer Barrett shifted uncomfortably nearby, now under the watchful eye of two other officers who had arrived on scene. The crowd's phones continued recording, capturing this unexpected lesson in how proper police work should be conducted. A young store clerk stepped forward, holding a cup of tea she'd brought from the cafe. "Mrs. Thompson always comes to my store," she said, offering the tea with trembling hands. "She buys books for her grandchildren and always asks about my college classes." This simple statement seemed to highlight the absurdity of suspecting Mrs. Thompson of shoplifting. Captain Thompson nodded gratefully at the clerk before turning to address the gathering of witnesses. His voice carried clearly through the mall's atrium. "I want to thank everyone who stepped forward to help my mother and to document this incident. Your actions today show what community really means. The mall's security supervisor approached with more footage, explaining how their cameras had captured everything from multiple angles. Captain, we have clear views of Officer Barrett's approach and the... He paused, choosing his words carefully, the escalation of the situation. 2 internal affairs investigators had arrived, their badges gleaming under the mall lights. They moved with quick efficiency, gathering statements from witnesses while everything was still fresh. Captain Thompson's reputation had preceded him. Everyone knew he'd want this handled by the book, personal involvement or not. Mrs. Thompson watched her son work, pride mixing with the lingering shock of what had happened. She had taught her children to face injustice with dignity and to work within the system for change. Now she was watching those lessons play out in front of her. A small group of elderly shoppers who had witnessed everything approached Captain Thompson. "We're from her church group," one woman explained, her voice quavering with emotion. "We've known Eleanor for 20 years. She volunteers at every food drive, helps with the youth programs." Captain Thompson listened to each statement, treating every witness with the same professional courtesy, whether they were teenagers with phone recordings or elderly church ladies with trembling voices. His approach was turning this terrible incident into a masterclass in proper police procedure. The medical team finished their examination, documenting the bruising on Mrs. Thompson's arm with professional thoroughness. "Nothing's broken," they assured Captain Thompson, "but she'll need to ice it and should follow up with her doctor." Through it all, Officer Barrett stood silently, watching as the consequences of his actions unfolded around him. The contrast between his earlier aggressive behavior and Captain Thompson's professional handling of the situation was a lesson that everyone present would remember. The afternoon was growing late, and the mall's regular closing time was approaching. But this wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was becoming a moment that would change how the entire department approached community policing. Captain Thompson's handling of this personal crisis was about to become a template for professional police response. The mall's security office had transformed into an impromptu command center. Television screens lined one wall, each showing a different angle of the incident. The clarity of the footage left no room for doubt about what had occurred, and every person watching the playback winced at the moment Officer Barrett struck Mrs. Thompson. "Play that section again," requested one of the internal affairs investigators, leaning forward in his chair. The security manager rewound the footage, and everyone watched as the scene unfolded once more. The timestamps in the corner of each video provided an exact timeline of events, from Officer Barrett's first suspicious glances to the moment Captain Thompson arrived. Outside the security office, the story was already spreading through social media. The young man who'd captured the clearest video had posted it online, and within hours it had been shared thousands of times. Local news vans were pulling into the mall parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching up into the darkening sky. Mrs. Thompson sat in a comfortable chair brought in from the mall's administrative office, an ice pack wrapped in a soft cloth pressed against her arm. She was surrounded by a protective circle of supporters, the store clerk who'd brought her tea, 2 of her former students who worked at the mall, and the elderly couple who'd witnessed everything from the beginning. Mrs. Thompson, one of her former students, said softly, "I remember when you taught us about standing up for what's right. You always said it wasn't just about being brave, but about being smart and dignified too." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You showed us that today." Captain Thompson was moving between groups with quiet efficiency, ensuring that every witness statement was properly recorded, every piece of evidence properly logged. His training had taught him that thorough documentation was crucial, but his personal stake in this case made him even more meticulous. The mall's general manager arrived, having rushed back from a business meeting across town. "I want to personally apologize," he said to Mrs. Thompson, his face drawn with concern. "You've been shopping here for decades. This should never have happened." Meanwhile, Officer Barrett sat in a separate office, writing his incident report under the watchful eye of his supervising officer. His hands trembled slightly as he typed, the gravity of his actions finally seeming to sink in. The sound of his keyboard clicking was the only noise in the room. More witnesses continued to arrive at the security office, having heard what happened and wanting to speak up about Mrs. Thompson's character. A librarian came by to tell how Mrs. Thompson volunteered for Children's Reading Hour every week. The owner of the small bakery in the mall brought a box of Mrs. Thompson's favorite cookies, talking about how she always bought treats for the hospital volunteers. The internal affairs investigators moved methodically through the evidence, their expressions growing grimmer with each new video angle they reviewed. They had handled many cases of police misconduct, but the combination of clear video evidence and multiple witness statements made this one particularly straightforward. As evening fell, the mall's regular closing announcement echoed through the nearly empty corridors. But in the security office, work continued. Captain Thompson's phone kept buzzing with messages from department leadership and community leaders, all demanding updates and expressing their concern. Mrs. Thompson watched all this activity with a teacher's observant eye. She saw how her son maintained his professional demeanor while coordinating with various authorities. She noticed how the witnesses, young and old, came together to support justice. Even in this difficult moment, she recognized a teaching opportunity about community, accountability, and proper procedure. The security manager approached Captain Thompson with another tablet. "Sir, we found additional footage from the exterior cameras. It shows Officer Barrett's arrival at the mall and his behavior before the incident. You might want to see this." As they reviewed this new footage, it became clear that this case would be about more than just one afternoon's events. It would raise questions about training, about prejudice, about how officers approach their duties. But most importantly, it would show how a community can come together when one of its beloved members faces injustice. By the next morning, the incident at Riverside Mall had become the talk of the entire city. The local news stations ran the story as their lead, showing carefully edited portions of the witness videos. Outside the police headquarters, a crowd of community members gathered, not in anger, but in solidarity, holding signs supporting Mrs. Thompson and calling for positive change. The police chief called an emergency press conference in the department's main meeting room. Captain Thompson stood nearby, his uniform crisp and neat despite having worked through most of the night. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row, her church friends flanking her like protective angels, her arm now wrapped in a proper bandage from her doctor's visit earlier that morning. "What happened yesterday," the police chief began, his voice heavy with emotion, "is not representative of our department's values or training. We are taking immediate action to address this incident and the underlying issues it has revealed." The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and citizens, all listening intently as the chief outlined the department's response. But it was what happened next that truly captured everyone's attention. Captain Thompson stepped forward to the podium, his mother's quiet strength seeming to flow into him as he spoke. "As both a police captain and the son of the victim in this incident, I stand before you today with a unique perspective," he began. "This is not just about one incident or one officer. This is about how we as a department serve and protect all members of our community." In the audience, people nodded in agreement. A group of Mrs. Thompson's former students, now adults with their own children, sat together, some wiping tears from their eyes as they watched their beloved teacher's son speak with such dignity and purpose. "My mother spent 32 years teaching our children about respect, fairness, and doing what's right," Captain Thompson continued. "Today, we have an opportunity to put those lessons into practice. We're announcing several immediate changes to our department's training and community engagement programs." The chief then detailed their action plan: mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, expanded community outreach programs, and a new citizen advisory board that would include Mrs. Thompson as one of its founding members. From her seat in the front row, Mrs. Thompson watched with quiet pride. She had always taught her students that every challenge was an opportunity to learn and grow. Now, her own difficult experience was being transformed into something positive for the entire community. Local business owners from the mall stood up to share their stories about Mrs. Thompson's kindness over the years. The young store clerk who had brought her tea spoke about how Mrs. Thompson had encouraged her to apply for college and had written her recommendation letter. The mall's security team presented their complete investigation findings, including footage showing that Officer Barrett had targeted several other elderly shoppers of color in previous weeks. This revelation led to an even broader investigation of his past conduct. Community leaders praised Captain Thompson's handling of the situation, noting how he had maintained professionalism despite the personal nature of the incident. His approach was already being considered as a model for other departments facing similar challenges. Mrs. Thompson's church group announced the creation of a scholarship in her name, aimed at supporting students who wanted to pursue careers in community service or education. The first donation came from the mall's management, followed quickly by contributions from local businesses and citizens. As the press conference concluded, something remarkable happened. The gathered crowd spontaneously broke into applause. Not the kind of angry protest many had expected, but a unified show of support for positive change. It was a moment that showed how one community could come together to turn an incident of injustice into an opportunity for growth and improvement. The local news cameras captured it all: the dignity of Mrs. Thompson and her son, the commitment of the police department to do better, and the community's determination to work together for meaningful change. This wasn't just a story about what went wrong anymore. It was becoming a story about how to make things right. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest training room was filled to capacity. Captain Thompson stood at the front, his presentation slides showing stills from that day at the mall. But this wasn't a session about what went wrong. It was about creating meaningful change. Today, he began, looking across the room of officers, both veteran and rookie. We're not just talking about procedures. We're talking about people. About mothers, grandmothers, and community members who deserve our respect and protection. His voice carried the weight of personal experience, but also the hope of positive transformation. Officer Barrett's termination had been announced the previous day, following a thorough investigation that revealed a pattern of concerning behavior. But rather than letting this be the end of the story, the department was using it as a catalyst for reform. Mrs. Thompson had been invited to speak at the training session. She walked to the front slowly, her arms still showing faint traces of bruising, but her head held high. The room fell completely silent as she took her place at the podium. "I spent my life teaching children," she began, her voice clear and strong. "And one thing I've always told them is that mistakes are opportunities to learn and grow. What happened to me was wrong, but what happens next is what truly matters." The officers in the room leaned forward, many taking notes. This wasn't the angry speech some might have expected. Instead, it was a masterclass in dignity and wisdom from someone who had every right to be bitter, but chose to be better. In the back of the room, community leaders watched with approval. The training program, now dubbed the Thompson Protocol, was becoming a model for other departments across the state. It focused on de-escalation techniques, cultural awareness, and the importance of treating every community member with respect. When that officer approached me, Mrs. Thompson continued, he didn't see a retired teacher who had given 3 decades to this community. He didn't see a grandmother shopping for her grandchildren. He didn't see me at all. And that's what needs to change. Captain Thompson watched his mother with pride, remembering all the times she had turned difficult moments into teaching opportunities in his own childhood. Now she was doing it again, but on a much larger scale. The training session included practical exercises, with officers role-playing various scenarios. Mrs. Thompson participated, helping them understand how their actions and words could impact community members. Her presence made the training real in a way that no textbook or video ever could. During the lunch break, several officers approached Mrs. Thompson to share their own stories. One spoke about his grandmother, who had faced similar prejudice. Another talked about how her own children attended the school where Mrs. Thompson had taught. These personal connections were building bridges that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The local news had been invited to cover portions of the training. Their cameras captured Mrs. Thompson working alongside officers, showing them the power of patience, respect, and understanding. The footage would later be used in a documentary about positive police reform. As the afternoon session began, Captain Thompson introduced a new component of the training. Community members would regularly participate in officer education programs. The goal was to ensure that those who served the community truly understood the people they were protecting. The mall's security team had also been invited to attend. They shared how the incident had led them to revise their own protocols, creating better cooperation between mall security and local law enforcement. The security guard who had finally stood up to Officer Barrett was recognized for his courage. Mrs. Thompson's former students, now spread across various professions, had started a social media campaign sharing stories of her positive influence on their lives. These stories were now being incorporated into the training materials, showing officers the ripple effects that their actions could have on a community. As the training day drew to a close, something unexpected happened. The officers gave Mrs. Thompson a standing ovation, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of genuine respect for her strength and wisdom. She had turned her moment of vulnerability into an opportunity to strengthen the entire community. 6 months after the incident at Riverside Mall, the community gathered in the high school auditorium for the first graduation ceremony of the Thompson Community Bridge program. The program, born from those difficult moments, had grown into something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Mrs. Thompson sat in the center of the front row, wearing her favorite blue dress and a bright smile. The bruises had long since faded, but the impact of her experience had created lasting change. Around her neck hung a medal, recently awarded by the mayor for her contributions to community healing and police reform. Captain Thompson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. Police officers sat next to community members, their uniforms a sharp contrast to casual civilian clothes. But unlike 6 months ago, there was no tension in the air, only a sense of shared purpose and understanding. When my mother was hurt that day, he began, his voice carrying through the packed auditorium. We could have let anger and bitterness take over. Instead, she taught us all one final lesson, perhaps her most important one yet. He paused, looking at his mother with pride. She showed us how to turn pain into progress. The first graduating class of the program included 30 police officers and 30 community members who had completed intensive training together. They had shared meals, stories, and experiences. They had learned to see past uniforms and stereotypes to recognize the humanity in each other. One of the graduating officers stood to share his story. 6 months ago, I was ready to quit the force, he admitted. What happened to Mrs. Thompson made me question everything. But through this program, I learned that being a good police officer isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding and serving our community. A teenager from the local youth center spoke next. Mrs. Thompson used to read to me when I was little, she said, her voice trembling slightly. When I saw what happened to her, I was angry and scared. But she showed us how to channel those feelings into making real change. The mall had become a partner in the program, offering its community room for weekly meetings between police and local residents. The security guard who had stood up that day was now a regular speaker, teaching others about the importance of moral courage. Mrs. Thompson's former students, now spread across various professions, had created a mentorship network. They connected young people with police officers for career guidance, breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. The local news stations were covering the graduation ceremony, but this time, there was no controversy to report. Instead, they captured images of police officers and community members embracing, sharing stories, and planning future projects together. As the ceremony continued, Captain Thompson unveiled the next phase of the program, It would be expanded to neighboring cities, with Mrs. Thompson serving as a key advisor. Her experience had become a blueprint for how communities could work together to create positive change. The incident that brought us here could have torn our community apart, Mrs. Thompson said as she took the podium for the closing speech. Instead, it brought us together. Remember, my dear students, and yes, you are all my students now, that the true measure of a community is not how it handles its moments of celebration, but how it rises from its moments of challenge. The graduates received their certificates to thunderous applause. Each one also received a small blue pin, the color of Mrs. Thompson's cardigan from that day, symbolizing their commitment to building bridges between law enforcement and the community. As the ceremony ended, people lingered in the auditorium, sharing refreshments and stories. Officers who had once patrolled these streets with suspicion now chatted comfortably with residents they knew by name. Community members who had once viewed all police with distrust now saw the humans behind the badges. The final surprise of the evening came when the superintendent announced that the high school's community center would be renamed the Thompson Center for Community Unity. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears as she stood to accept this honor, surrounded by the love and respect of a community that had learned its most important lesson from her, that true strength lies not in power, but in understanding. The incident at Riverside Mall had started with one officer's prejudice, but it ended with an entire community's transformation. Mrs. Thompson's final lesson had turned out to be her most powerful, showing how even the darkest moments can lead to the brightest changes when people choose to learn, grow, and come together.